But I wanted to bring your attention this. I love gadgets, and this sort of new piece of gadgetry. Volvo Cars have designed a car which will use a camera that is focused on the driver's face. It will monitor pupil dilation and attention that the driver is paying to the road. It will also be able to monitor whether the driver is looking at a mobile phone. It will be able to monitor any erratic driving, the response timings to things that are happening in the road, and it will make an assessment of whether the driver is fit to drive, basically if the driver is drunk or under the influence. It will give out a warning, a verbal warning to the driver. If things don't change, then the car will automatically call a Volvo service line and slow down and pull over. So it will basically take control over from the car. Now, Volvo pride themselves from being one of the safest cars. They have a big reputation for safety since 1959, where they introduced Volvo were the first ones to introduce the 3-point seat belt. And what was quite fascinating about Volvo is that they could have patented that, but they gave it for free. So they didn't patent it, and that's why all cars now have a 3-point seat belt, which they used free of charge, even though Volvo came up with it. Now, before we move on to our first guest, you've got to understand the impact of drunk driving, right? 8,660 people were injured or killed on British roads in 2017 when the driver was over the alcohol limit. And also smartphone use has been cited as a reason for a global rise in road deaths. So something should be done. Is this the answer? Now, joining me on the line from Freeman and Co-Solicitors is Mr. Nick Freeman, also known as Mr. Loophole, motoring lawyer. Welcome to the show, Mr. Freeman.
Good morning, Alexis.
I've got to ask you about your nickname, Mr. Loophole. Please explain.
I was coined that by the media. I didn't like it, but it stuck with me, and eventually I trademarked it. So
you trademarked it?
Yeah, I trademarked it.
A proper lawyer.
A proper lawyer. So there's only one Mr. Loophole, I'm afraid, and you're talking to.
And what was? I mean, it suggests to me that you were able to find loopholes to get people off.
Well, yes. The reason I didn't like it was because it actually suggests something slightly sinister and underhand.
It does. I'll admit.
And all I'm doing is using the law. That's if the law's there and the prosecution or the police don't follow it, I'm saying to the court, look, this is what has failed in my view. Prosecution may agree or they may argue to the contrary, and a judge will decide who's right. And that's what happens. But the press obviously like to slightly sensationalise it, and they call it a loophole. In fact, it's just law. It's good old-fashioned law. It's in our statute books, and I try and highlight things that are wrong.
So what do you make of these Volvo cars? Can you see any legal problems here of a car taking control from a driver? You own it, you want to drive it, and all of a sudden it's not letting you do that.
Well, as you rightly said, we go back to 1959 when they started to climb the moral staircase, and they're a long way up it now. There was, in fact, a survey in 2014 that said that Volvo drivers are morally more upright. So I think what they're doing is they're coining a particular area of the market of people who are going to be very safe drivers, who aren't going to be inclined to drink and drive, take drugs. They're going to drive very cautiously. And you're probably aware that I think in 2020 they're planning to limit the maximum speed of all Volvos to
that's 112 miles.
12 miles an hour. So they're moving in a certain type of direction which will attract a certain type of driver. It certainly wouldn't appeal to me. In my view, what they're doing is they're having a system in place for people who basically are impaired. And people who are impaired, their judgment obviously doesn't work in the normal way. And when they're required to follow instructions, they tend to be confused about those instructions. And I think potentially it's a very dangerous situation. Because it's rather like having the automatic cars that are going to be coming about very soon, but for the impaired. And under this particular scheme, they're going to be allowed to, for example, do an emergency stop if the driver doesn't respond in an appropriate way. So you can imagine driving down the motorway, everyone else is driving normally, and all of a sudden the Volvo in front of you, for no apparent reason, because other drivers will be unaware of what's happening, does an emergency stop on the outside lane of the motorway.
Well, I'm sure, Mr. Freeman, that, I mean, first of all, you don't know that, and I don't know that, and I don't think someone like Volvo would design something that would do that. The cameras that are equipped, the cars that are equipped with so many surround cameras, I'm sure it would be checking the surroundings before it did anything of the sort. I don't think they would design a car that would do an emergency stop on the outside lane of the M25.
Well, they're certainly saying that they will do emergency stops in appropriate circumstances. Now, I don't know. From what I've read, the cameras seem to be on the inside as opposed to the outside. They're concentrating on the driver, is pupil dilation, etc., etc. But the point is this. Other drivers are going to be completely unaware of what is going on inside that car. And would it not be better to have a system in place where a driver, rather than mid-journey, there's an intervention to stop him driving in the first place, to have some software attached to the ignition.
So how about an ignition that will only start if you blow into a tube, and if you're over the limit, you can't start the car.
Absolutely.
Would you be a fan of that?
I'm very much in favour of having safe roads and safe driving. Absolutely support it. It's got to be proportionate, reasonable and sensible. And I think it's much better to stop people driving rather than saying, right, you're mid-journey, I think you're not fit to be on the road. Of course, it might be too late at that point, or we've then got to deal with somebody who is impaired, and that is a potentially hazardous situation. Much better and much simpler to have the software in place where they can't actually drive, where the ignition won't ignite, they can't move forward, and that is it. But there, of course, then is the legal problems, which is what you initially asked me about, and that's who is actually driving the car, who is in control. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine the sort of criminal and civil confusion that's going to be if there is an accident, and that there inevitably will be accidents, when the driver's saying, look, I was trying to drive, yes, I was over the limit, but Volvo intervened and took control, and they were responsible for the accident. It was they who caused the accident. You know, we've got a sort of a hybrid situation, haven't we, where we've got a driver and somebody else driving the car in almost an autonomous way. And I think it's a recipe for disaster. One of the big criticisms of autonomous vehicles is, of course, it will only work if every other vehicle is autonomous. And here we're talking about a tiny minority of vehicles. Volvo are a small percentage of all cars on the road. And unless every other car is going to have the same sort of software, I think it's a potentially dangerous situation, but I am very much in favour of having safer cars and safer roads.
What about preventing people? Because one of the big issues that we have at the moment, and I see it a lot. I'm a motorbike driver in London, so I get to see inside people's cars as I'm filtering through traffic, and I get to see what people are doing in their cars as they're driving. And I can tell you that there are a lot of people still on their phones, using their phones, texting, fiddling with their phones whilst they're driving. What about that? And I'm sure you will have had many cases, perhaps, where people have been caught on their phone, and maybe you found a loophole there to save them.
There are lots of legal arguments about that, but what we're concerned with is trying to prevent it, aren't we? Mm-hmm. And you know, the interesting thing is we have a legal system in place where if you use your phone on a hands-free basis, prima facie, that is lawful. And you know, statistics show, the research shows that actually, whether you're handheld or hands-free, the level of distraction is exactly the same. And they ironically equate it with somebody who is over the drink-drive limit. And when you're over the drink-drive limit, just over it, the chances of you having an accident increase fourfold. So we have this perverse situation when everyone is professing to be concerned with road safety, where we say, look, as long as you're not holding your phone, and I'm simplifying things, but as long as it's not in your hand, it's permissible to use it. That is just as dangerous as having it hands-free, and that is just as dangerous as drink driving. So we need to have a root and branch reform, and we need to have it done by people who actually understand what the law is and what the consequences are. Because as you say, constantly, even though the penalty's been increased, you see people who completely ignore the law because they know that they're not going to be caught. They can't even be caught on camera by another driver now because, of course, it's illegal to do that. You're using your phone for an interactive purpose. So in my view, to deal with that, yes, we can have software inside the car or an ignition that turns the phone off, and the phones can only be used, for example, on an emergency basis, which I think is sensible. I think phones should be banned from cars completely unless for an emergency.
Interesting.
That will make our roads much safer, and we also need a penalty that polices itself, and increasing the points from 3 to 6 hasn't made a ha'porth of difference.
No.
If you said we're going to introduce a mandatory disqualification, that might make people sit up and think, actually, it's not worth taking the risk.
Okay, thank you very, very much for your thoughts there. That's Nick Freeman, Mr. Loophole, motoring lawyer from Freeman & Co. Solicitors.